It's been a long journey. I traveled through vast, unexplored fields. I sailed across the endless, uncharted seas. I made a couple of U-turns because I kept getting lost. But alas, I'm finally here, and now it's time to enact my revenge. Your reign of terror is over. Prepare yourself. Akari.
くだらない。
Keep sneering while you can, because with this magical ring, I'm able to summon cute, super powerful waifus to aid me in battle. Well, there goes that.
姑息な手しかできないハムシが私様を倒すなんて100年早いわ。恥を知れ。
Don't think this is over yet. You've now left me with no other choice. I am the bone of my sword. Steel is my body and fire is my blood. I have created over 1,000. Couldn't you at least let me finish reciting?
誰がそんな愚かなことをするものか。
Well, that's not fair. How am I supposed to defeat you now? Is it too late to choose fleeing? Dang, I guess I should have grinded a few more levels.
ここにいたのか。出前が届いたよ。あ、これ聞いたことがあるわ。自分の友達や知り合いの役割を設定し冒険するゲームでしょ。どれどれ、あたしお姫様にしたのかな。死ね、死ね、死ね。
Wait, Akari, not the window! Oomph! Dang, I just had that one fixed. Anyway, let's get on with the video. I don't think it's a particularly hot take to say that 2024 wasn't exactly an amazing year for visual novels, especially once you compare it to 2023, a year which brought us hitters like Hira Hira Hihiru, Amakano 2+, and of course, Sakura no Toki. In contrast, 2024 was defined by releases that were either just decent or which fell slightly below expectations. That said, there were still a few surprises along the way, one of those being today's VN. I will admit that I was slightly apprehensive about reading it, since I'm not the biggest Chuni fan, but despite that, I still felt it was a worthwhile read. Hey there, this is Marin, and this is my review of Kyokkou no Marriage.
Story.
The story takes place in ensemble, a monastery and academy of wizardry located in the religious-inclined state of Midie. Due to the ongoing threat from the neighboring empire, which seeks to eradicate all magical anomalies, students in ensemble undergo specialized training to defend against any potential future confrontations. A decade prior, Midie faced a dire crisis, narrowly averted thanks to the aid of the brides, fairy-like beings of immense magic power who managed to repel the invaders. However, these brides only materialize once a human pledges to supply them with their magical energy, a bond sealed by placing a ring on the human's finger, therefore becoming their bearer. Now that I think about it, this game must have been on a mission to tick all the common fantasy trope boxes. At any rate, these rings are safeguarded by the Holy Church, with its headquarters situated within the ensemble Academy itself, and just when the next bearer among the students is about to be chosen, our protagonist, Sreng, kicks down the door and barges in dramatically, thus interrupting the ceremony. He presents himself to become the rightful chosen one, challenging the current candidate to a one-on-one magic duel. To the surprise of many at the Academy, he emerges triumphant and is recognized as the next bearer of the bride, Leah. I'm willing to bet that some of you might have already noticed that this game's premise has some similarities with another, rather famous VN, whose title is divided with a /. I'm, of course, referring to Candy Girl. Wait, what? God damn it, you already had your own video. Stop screwing with my script. Anyway, the parallels between Fate and Kyokkou no Marriage become immediately clear right from the start, with brides serving as the Kyokkou equivalent of servants. Without delving too much into spoilers, there are a few other moments that almost feel like references or even homages to Fate. But I believe the game still has enough unique ideas to stand on its own and maintain its identity. In fact, I would go as far as to say that If you enjoyed Fate but hoped it had fewer super muscular dudes, there's a decent chance you will enjoy Kyokkou. At any rate, to me, the way Kyokkou plays around with the premise and its overall logic was one of the story's strongest points. It can be quite creative with how it implements it into plot events and even the world's lore. For instance, in order for brides to maintain their form and magic powers, they need to be constantly supplied with the bearer's mana, which in essence means sacrificing and shortening the bearer's own life. I think this idea of turning the brides into essentially ticking bombs, or I guess magical leeches, was fresh and helped convey the weight and mental pressure of being connected to one of them. And no, before you ask, mana transfer doesn't work here. Not that that's going to stop any of them from trying though. However, at its core, this is a story about revenge. This isn't really a spoiler since the first scene shows the protagonist making a vow to seek retribution for the tragedy that is unfolding before his eyes. This is not only the main driving factor of the story, but also its most interesting aspect. Truth be told, if there's one thing Kyokkou No Marriage deserves to be praised for above all, it's how it handles its mystery. I think it managed to strike a nice balance between revealing information, presenting questions, and introducing unexpected plot twists. Be warned, though, that the game takes a while to pick up steam. In fact, there's precisely one plot event that pretty much marks the turning point when the story finally gains momentum, but everything leading up to it is unfortunately rather unremarkable. Whatever the case, let's move on to the characters. The main cast consists of the protagonist's bride, Leah, and his two schoolmates, Chloe and Fanai. Out of the three, in my opinion, Leah is the one that's the most immediately likable. As a bride, she suffers the disadvantage of having her memory reset every time she's summoned by a new bearer. So despite her power, Leah is presented as someone vulnerable and rather exposed in more than one meaning, which is why I found her slightly meek and naive demeanor to work well. The other two characters, while not terrible by any means, certainly took a bit more time for me to click with. The problem is that they first come across as very one-note. For example, Fanai's whole shtick is that she takes pleasure in being verbally abused.
ひどい。ひどい。やっぱりひどい。
That's all there is to her for most of the common route, and this gag never evolves at all. As for Chloe, well, I think a clip is worth 1,000 words.
おはよう、二人とも。
She does improve over time, but needless to say, first impressions weren't great. If common roots exist to make you care for the characters, Kyokkou No Marriage simply fell short. Regarding the secondary characters, they were all right. Out of the bunch, I quite liked Onbelt. He's like a slightly less autistic version of Mitsurugi Reiji. Just slightly less. Fortunately, the actual routes fare exponentially better. The game has an enforced play order, but it has it for a reason, as each route is meant to reveal one facet of the grand mystery. The first one, Leah's route, was decently paced and had a satisfying conclusion. I did, however, feel that the adversaries they faced weren't that well introduced. In most action-focused VNs, it's a common practice to have the main characters face some sort of unwinnable battle to show how strong their enemies are. But in Leah's route, that first fight usually ended up being the only fight. In retrospect, one could argue that Leah's route itself was meant to serve as an introductory battleground, making further confrontations in the following routes more meaningful. On the topic of the fights, while I will admit that I'm not the biggest Chunin enthusiast, I was at least hoping to see a bit more of a battle of wits between them. As it stands, most fights devolved into the clashes of ideals alongside power-level competitions you often see in this genre. There were also a couple of fights where characters were suddenly able to do not particularly well-explained actions that left me slightly dumbfounded. I will admit, though, some were kind of hype. That said, I will applaud the game for how convincingly each storyline was told. After finishing Leah's route, I was left under the impression that she was by all means the central heroine, and that there was no room for any other significant plotlines. But the game always found ways to direct the narrative in a compelling manner. This is mostly thanks to its finesse in leaving just enough clues for its unsolved mysteries. Another aspect I appreciated was that, when entering a new route, you would often be more knowledgeable about the situation than the characters themselves. but oftentimes the game didn't waste much time bringing them up to speed. As for Chloe and Finay's roots, there's not that much I can say about them without straight up spoiling the story, but I like the way the plot got progressively darker, even if I felt it could have gone a bit further. But that's just a matter of personal taste, or personal issues, give or take. Both of their routes also made the characters much more likable, far more than in the common route. Maybe Finay's route was slightly uneven in terms of quality, with the highest highs but also the lowest lows. For instance, there's a point in the story where it kind of feels like her arc is done, yet it was only the midpoint of her route. Regardless, it all culminated in a climactic way that felt like a natural progression of the story. With all that being said, I feel like I need to point out the main peculiarity of this game, which is the way the story was constructed. My gut instinct tells me that they wrote it starting from the end and then moved backwards, adding plot twists here and there until reaching the starting point. This would explain why the game starts rather weak but progressively gets better. When playing it, I got the impression that the game expected you to already like the main characters from the get-go, given their rather unceremonious introductions, almost as if you had known them for a long time. That might have been true for the writers themselves, but probably not so much for the players. Furthermore, there's another reason I believe it was written this way, which is how world building was handled. To me, it felt like every lore detail and even every aspect of the characters' personalities existed either to serve a relevant plot event or as a result of one. For example, it's never shown what the Empire really looks like, because that wouldn't be relevant to the plot. There were also no secondary characters that weren't directly tied to the story, because once again, they wouldn't be relevant to the plot. To the game's credit, it is a good plot. I really don't want to downplay that. But at times, it felt more like reading a stage play rather than a story set in a plausible and believable fantasy world. And yes, I'm aware that's a bit of an oxymoron.
演出
Regarding its visual presentation, I think the game looks quite good. Sprites are nicely detailed, with big, round, voluptuous hairstyles. Okay, the game can be a bit cheeky with its fan service. I'm not the type of person that complains about this sort of thing, but there were a couple of supposedly dramatic CGs that to me were slightly undermined by the, let's say, interesting visual composition they chose. Still, this is hardly an issue, just something that I think might bother some. As far as the audio department is concerned, I think it's mostly fine, but I did have a couple of gripes with it. First of all, while it's a nice touch to have the MC voiced, I can't say I was fully sold in his performance. I think he did a good job at showing the personality depth of his role, but whenever he tried to sound happy, it just came across as a bit forced to me. Sound effects were another area that I found just slightly underwhelming. The game uses a library of sounds that I'm fairly sure I must have heard a dozen times by now in other VNs. I think it somewhat cheapens the experience and makes some scenes, especially the fight scenes, feel less impactful. The OST is decent enough. It nicely fits the medieval fantasy setting. Perhaps the track changes were a bit predictable, but that's a really minor complaint. Also, I did like how you could set the system voice to the greatest character of the VN.
極光のマリアージュ
Unfortunately, only the title and the developer's name are voiced. What a shame.
まとめ
To conclude, Kyokkou No Marriage is a visual novel that delivers where it matters most, but falters in the details. The core story is remarkably strong and well thought out, consistently offering unexpected twists. The characters, while initially somewhat one-dimensional, eventually reveal deeper layers of complexity and personal richness. The game's main drawback, however, is its lack of world-building depth, making it slightly hard to get fully immersed in its fantasy setting. It's also a game that requires a fair amount of patience, since in all honesty, the first hours can be a bit of a slog to get through. That said, even if I wouldn't go as far as to call it a modern kamige, I still believe it's worth playing, especially for fans of action-focused visual novels. I give Kyokkou No Marriage a 7.5 out of 10, and that's going to be it for the review. I was actually planning on playing and reviewing a different VN, but I just ended up finishing this one first. It's not like I regret it. This one was alright too. Maybe not as great, but still. I will say, even if it wasn't straight up plagiarizing it, The similarities with Fate were amusingly obvious. It can be fun to try to point out the possible references and shared ideas between the two. Hell, you could even make it a drinking game. Oh right, I also forgot to mention that there's a Switch version, although, weirdly enough, that one only includes Leah's route. Maybe I could make a comparison video between the two. I think that could be interesting. I'm joking. Cheese. Anyway, I'm going to end the video here. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Mayrin out.